Welcome back to our BCBA mock exam preparation channel. Today we're covering one of the most important topics in applied behavior analysis, functional behavior assessment, or FBA. FBA is considered the core assessment process in ABA because it directly informs how we design effective interventions. You'll notice on this slide a key flow from behavior to function, then to intervention. This sequence is critical. If we don't correctly identify the function of behavior, our intervention is likely to fail. FBA is also a high-frequency exam topic, so mastering both the concepts and application is essential. If you want to practice real exam scenarios, you can also check out www.bmockexam.com. Let's start with the core question. Why do we even need FBA? Because behavior is not random, it is functionally related to its environment. FBA allows us to identify the function of behavior, meaning the environmental variables that maintain it. Once we know the function, we can select an intervention that directly addresses it. Without FBA, intervention becomes guesswork. You might reduce behavior temporarily, but it won't be systematic or durable. So in both practice and the exam, the rule is simple: from correct function to effective intervention. Formally, a functional behavior assessment is a systematic process for identifying the function of behavior through data collection, analysis, and hypothesis development. There are 4 key components. First, we collect data. Second, we analyze patterns. Third, we develop a hypothesis about function. And fourth, we test that hypothesis through intervention. So FBA is not a single tool. It is a process of scientific reasoning applied to behavior. This is the most important concept in all of FBA. Behavior is functional. That means behavior occurs because it produces a consequence that is reinforcing. So every behavior serves a purpose. In ABA, we break this into 3 parts. Behavior, what the individual does. Consequence, what happens after. Function, why the behavior continues. Your job as a behavior analyst is to move beyond what you see and identify the functional relationship between behavior and consequence. There are 3 main types of FBA, and they differ in how strongly they allow us to identify function. Indirect assessment is based on report. Descriptive assessment is based on direct observation. Functional analysis is based on experimental manipulation. As we move across these types, we increase our ability to identify causal relationships, not just patterns. This distinction, especially correlation versus causation, is heavily tested on the BCBA exam. Indirect FBA involves gathering information through interviews, rating scales, and questionnaires. It relies on the verbal report of others, rather than direct observation. Because of that, it is fast and efficient, but also less reliable. From an exam perspective, if the data comes from what someone says happened, rather than what was directly observed, that is indirect assessment. For example, a parent describing behavior patterns, a teacher completing a rating scale, or a checklist summarizing behavior frequency. These tools can give us useful hypotheses, but they are not sufficient to confirm function. So think of indirect FBA as a way to generate ideas, not prove them. The biggest limitation of indirect FBA is that it is subjective and potentially biased. People may misremember events, interpret behavior differently, or miss important variables. So indirect data is considered low-confidence evidence. A very common exam trap is treating indirect information as if it proves function. It does not. It must always be followed by direct observation or experimental analysis. Descriptive FBA involves direct observation of behavior in the natural environment. Here, we are not asking people what happened. We are actually watching and recording behavior. The goal is to identify patterns between environmental events and behavior. This makes descriptive assessment more objective than indirect methods. The primary tool used in descriptive FBA is ABC data. It envelopes 3 key elements, which are antecedent, which is what happens before behavior; behavior, which is the observable response; consequence, which is what happens after. By collecting repeated ABC observations, we can identify patterns that suggest function. But here's the key limitation: ABC data shows correlation, not causation. And that distinction is critical for the exam. Descriptive FBA has several strengths. It captures behavior in real-world contexts, which increases ecological validity. It is more objective than indirect methods, because it is based on direct observation. It allows us to identify patterns across multiple observations. And overall, it provides more reliable data than indirect assessment alone. This makes descriptive FBA a strong middle step between indirect methods and functional analysis. Despite its strengths, descriptive FBA has limitations. It lacks experimental control, meaning we cannot manipulate variables. Because of this, it cannot establish causal relationships. It is also correlational, meaning we only observe associations. And sometimes, important variables may be missed. A key exam trap is assuming that correlation equals function. Just because events occur together does not mean one causes the other. Functional analysis is the most advanced type of FBA. It involves systematic manipulation of environmental variables to identify the function of behavior. In this process, we test different conditions, such as attention, escape, or tangible access, and observe how behavior changes. Because variables are controlled, functional analysis allows us to establish causal relationships. This is why it is considered the gold standard of assessment in ABA. In functional analysis, we test specific conditions to identify function. The attention condition tests for social positive reinforcement. The escape condition tests for negative reinforcement. The tangible condition tests for access to items. And the alone or control condition helps identify automatic reinforcement. Each condition isolates a potential function, allowing us to determine what maintains the behavior. The logic of functional analysis follows a systematic sequence. First, we manipulate conditions by introducing or removing variables. Second, we measure behavior under each condition. Third, we compare results across conditions. And finally, we identify the function based on which condition produces the highest responding. This experimental approach allows us to move from correlation to causal understanding. Functional analysis provides several key advantages. It offers high accuracy because variables are directly tested. It allows for causal conclusions, not just correlations. It clearly distinguishes between different functions, such as attention or escape, and it provides the strongest evidence base for intervention planning. This is why FA is considered the gold standard in FBA. However, functional analysis also has limitations. It is time-intensive and requires careful planning. It requires trained professionals to implement correctly. There are also ethical considerations, as conditions may temporarily evoke problem behavior, and in some cases, behavior may increase during assessment. So while FA is highly accurate, it is not always the most practical option in every setting. When selecting an FBA method, we typically follow a progression. We start with indirect methods for quick information, then move to descriptive assessment for more reliable data, and use functional analysis when high accuracy is needed. The key is to balance accuracy and practicality based on client needs and available resources. FBA directly informs intervention. First, we identify the function of behavior. Then we match the intervention to that function. Next, we teach replacement behaviors that serve the same function. And finally, we monitor outcomes to ensure effectiveness. This sequence ensures that intervention is both function-based and evidence-based. On the BCBA exam, FBA is typically tested through scenario-based questions. You may be asked to identify the type of assessment, interpret ABC data, or determine function. To answer these questions, follow a structured approach. First, identify the assessment type. Next, analyze the data provided. Then, determine the function and select the appropriate intervention. Remember, always connect behavior, consequence, and function. Students often confuse indirect versus descriptive, which is reports versus direct observation. Descriptive versus functional analysis, which is correlation versus causation. And correlation versus function, which tells you to think whether patterns do not equal causation. Another trap is assuming the function without analyzing data. Always base your answer on evidence, not assumptions. A well-developed hypothesis statement clearly links antecedent, behavior, and function. The format is, when this happens, the individual does this behavior, maintained by this function. This statement guides intervention design and should be data-based and testable. In school settings, functional behavior assessment helps understand challenging behaviors and develop effective support plans. Clinically, it guides diagnosis and treatment, informing evidence-based strategies. Functional behavior assessment is crucial for creating behavior intervention plans that address behavior functions, leading to effective interventions, reduced problem behaviors, and improved outcomes. To summarize, FBA identifies the function of behavior, which is essential for intervention. There are 3 types, differing in control and accuracy. Function must guide treatment decisions. And FBA is a core, high-frequency topic on the BCBA exam. If you remember one thing, remember this: no function, no effective intervention. As you prepare for the BCBA exam, make sure you can confidently analyze FBA scenarios and identify function. If you want to strengthen these skills, you can practice with realistic mock exams at www.bcbamockexam.com. The more you practice applying FBA logic, the more automatic and accurate your reasoning will become.